Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels or City of Dead. That's what last week was with Halloween or City of Zombies or anything else you want to call it. Let's just stick with City of Dead. I like to say that. Anyhow, we have a great guest today. Mr. Gary Wayne is going to be telling us much about the Genesis 6 Genesis 6 conspiracy and also prophecies throughout the Bible. We're going to talk about giants. We're going to talk about other works of religion, other works of, written arts, not arts, written forms through the Quran or the, where is it, the Bhagavad Gita. You know what? I'm not very good at saying those, pronouncing now. So I'm going to let my guest do the rest, and I'm going to bring him on. So the one and only Gary Wayne's on the show. Gary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, and I have to tell you, not many people can say Bhagavad Gita and not stumble over it.
Yeah,
so
seriously,
you almost have to roll your tongue a little bit to get it out.
You do. I always get caught up on that one. Literally, that one more than anyone. Of course, you know about the where I wrote it down here. Of course, the other ones I know. The Quran. Obviously, that's pretty straightforward. So is the Bible. You can't really go wrong with that. I also saw Gilgamesh. And I don't know if that's connected to Bhagavad. Is that connected to the last part that I just said, the Gilgamesh?
Technically, no, but when you understand where the Hindu religion comes from as being migrated by the Aryans out of the Sumerian region, then all of a sudden you see that there's a direct connection and why there's so many cross references that are in Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and the religions of the Persians as a whole in that region. And so, yeah, there's a kind of a connection there for sure, but not in terms of being part of any of the holy scriptures that are written by, whether it's in the Rig Vedas or the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita or any of the other ones that they have in there. They have several sets of holy books. So distinct in that respect, but rooted in the same root religion that first organized after the flood.
Now, let me ask you about the Genesis 6 prophecy or conspiracy. What is the Genesis 6 conspiracy? Because some people look at Genesis as being the foundation, especially Book 6 as the foundation for flat Earth.
Well, it's one of those crossroads chapters in Genesis that takes you in a number of different directions, because the creation of the giants in verses 1 through 4 is the preamble to the flood story, and of course, which the Epic of Gilgamesh has an account with Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, depending on which translation you're reading from out of the Middle East, for the name, which would be the one who was captaining that ship as opposed to Noah. But anybody who digs deep into the Epic of Gilgamesh, understands very, very quickly he was Utnapishtim was 2/3 God and 1/3 human, just as Gilgamesh was, and same as Enkidu. So they're talking about giants in that version of the flood story. But so much comes out of Genesis 6 that it is sort of the epicenter for a lot of different sort of theories and things. For me, though, I look at Genesis 6 as this kind of very shocking story that's attached to the front end of the flood that seems to be one of the root causes to bring about the first apocalypse by water. And these are creatures that are created by a group of angels called the sons of God. And they take human females and they create giants, as it's recorded in the King James Version Bible. But when you take that back to Hebrew, it actually goes back to the word Nephil, and the I am is the male plural, where the Nephilim word comes from.
Isn't Nephilim referred to extraterrestrials?
Well, again, it's one of those terms that over time has sort of branched out to represent all sorts of different sort of thoughts. And some people also think that the Nephilim are also angels. And you can also, you can kind of make a case for that, but it's kind of stretching it, even taking it back to Hebrew. But, when you look at similar accounts of these demigods that are created in the other polytheist religions around the world and legends, and you understand that the offspring of the gods and a human female creates a demigod, and those would be like heroes in the Greek mythology, or you have the same thing going on in the Hindu religion with the Danuwa or the Datia or the Asuras or the Myosi in China or the Anunnaki in Sumeria, which is who the Epic of Gilgamesh's legends and stories would come out of. Xibalba out of the Popol Vuh of the Quiché Maya. You've got the Tengu, which is a different form of Nephilim. And you can go on and on and on with all these different names that have the same creation around the world that are called Nephilim. And where that connection sort of draws a nice little bow tie on it to say that they might be used in a similar fashion, Nephilim of the earth, Nephilim of heaven, is that in the Greek mythology, which is the easiest one, and the Sumerian one that most people are most familiar with, is you have the Anunnaki in the Sumerian mythology of heaven or from outer space, again, depending on which branch you're going to take that down. And you also have the Anunnaki of the earth that they created. So these are sort of like those demigods. And just as in Greek mythology, you have the Titans of heaven and the Titans of the earth. And the heroes are also known as Titans. So when you get into, let's say, the Atlantis mythology, for example, and you have Poseidon who takes a human female, and depending on whether or not you're reading the version as Iapetus or Poseidon, he'll take a human female by the name of Clymene or Clyto and produce 10 demigod kings for the Atlantean Empire. So it's all describing the same sort of thing. So you can make that case, but biblically, it's a little bit difficult. You have to kind of overlay that. Then it starts to distort what the meaning is as you get into these Nephilim, who are the offspring of these sons of God. So I kind of side on it that I think that at one time they probably were, but biblically we just don't have that as a smoking gun verse to say so.
Let me thank real quick Tammy George for the super chat. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the super chat. Now, going back to you, Gary, what got you involved into these mysteries? And let me ask you another question to add to that, too. Are you familiar with Michael Cremo's work about the giants here in America?
I'm not necessarily familiar with his work. I am familiar with giants in North America as a whole. In fact, I worked with L.A. Marzulli on a couple of his videos about the Serpent
Watcher
Mounds.
series, right?
Well, it's about the Serpent Mound series is the one that I did, which is sort of more recent in the last year or two, which is all about the giants in North America and the red-headed giants and, where did the technology come from to build the Serpent Mounds? Where did the people come from? What happened to them? And he does a great job in covering that on a series of DVDs. So I am quite familiar with the North American legends and I would say history of the giants, because in basically every tribe in North America, they have a very rich history of a group of giants, and they all seem to have a similar sort of description in activity and similar types of stories. And it's not an uncommon thing. It's just not commonly talked about in history.
You mentioned our L.A. Marzulli, which I'm glad he's still doing films. He moved away from Los Angeles after his home was burnt down last year. And you probably know who Richard Shaw was. Richard Shaw, right?
Yes.
And he passed away recently?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he was the one that was the other half of L.A. Marzulli when they did the Watcher series. But I know they've both done projects by themselves. Now,
yes.
Did you contribute to some of the Watcher series when the two of them were working together?
No, I did not. I met L.A. Marzulli about a year ago at a conference that we were doing together called Operation Classified, and we kind of hit it off. I was familiar with his work. He wasn't really familiar with my work, and we just kind of hit it off. And he said, "I got to get you into some of my videos." So I've done a couple with him, and we'll be working with him again in July at True Legends. We're both speaking at that conference in July. And so looking forward to seeing him again and see whether or not we're going to do some more work together.
Here's a question for you. This is from Lasha Senyak. What are the lost keys of Enki? Can he explain their significance?
Yeah, the lost keys of Enki comes again right out of the Sumerian mythology. And typically these keys that they're talking about, it's more of an allegory to a set of knowledge. So whether or not it is an actual key or it is, like an algorithmic formula or something like that, it's really sort of hard to know. But when you're talking about the keys and the knowledge that came from the gods in prehistory, this is the knowledge that was developed to a level that I would say would be greater than what we have today. So when people are looking for the keys to Enki today, as you flip that into sort of the modern lingo in terms of what they're looking for, it's more into gematria and the complex calculations in quantum physics and trying to get at what they call the Atma particle by using quantum computing and AI to track this missing particle down that gives you access through quantum entanglement to all the knowledge in the universe instantaneously. And this is the knowledge that is being searched for in, at least from an occult perspective, in terms of how they would define it. And one of the fallen angels that they would describe that is leading this, or this entity that's from off-world, is Metatron, that comes out of Third Enoch.
That's right.
That
yes.
is kind of guiding all of this. So, and one of the things that you learn as you peel the onion back about prehistory is every account is telling a similar story about the same set of events. I'm not necessarily saying that there was one civilization. When you dig into prehistory, you're given 4, you're given 7, you're given 9, and some occasions you're even giving 11, and one with that even has more of a parent civilization before that. So there was a lot of different accounts that were going on in the world about the same set of events, but they have the same kind of organizational structure from a religious perspective, just gods with different vernacular names and some different vernacular rituals, but they have basically the same set of pantheon. They build the same kinds of structures, like, let's say, the most obvious one would be pyramids with the same type of sacred geometry, and honoring the same set of gods or alien intelligence if you go down the ancient alien mythos end of it. They're all talking about the same type of individuals and the same set of events that also brought about the first apocalypse.
Now, let me ask you, since you brought about this for a moment, the giants of Kandahar. You mentioned Steve Quayle. I told you about another person I know who was one of the people that was shooting at this giant, and he told me that it was in Kandahar in Afghanistan. And once this giant was disturbed, it was speaking in a very garbly voice. Couldn't ascertain any words or anything. It was, I don't know, I can't really tell perspective, but they say it was almost double the size of what a human would be, and the weight was 1,200 pounds. They said they estimated it because it took 2 Chinook helicopters to carry it out of there. And this giant was taking bullets like nothing, and it was almost as if it were wearing armor. That each of the bullets that were shot to him were not hitting him per se, or they weren't causing the effect that would normally be caused to another human. What do you know about that story? Oh, we lost him. Hold on a second, folks. Hang tight, folks. Gary, we lost you for a second. Yeah, I was wondering what happened. So I was asking.
Not sure.
yeah, maybe some interference by the Giants, but I hope not. But let me ask you, because I see some questions in the chat. I do want to get to them. I want to ask you about the Giants of Kandahar.
Yes, I got that question before I got cut off. So, it's a riveting story. I actually had a chance to listen to the interview that Steve Quayle had done on a replay podcast, and he had the pilot, and I was absolutely struck by the accuracy of the details as I would have dug into, as I did dig into, in terms of what these giants looked like and how large they were and some of the other descriptions. So let me just give you a quick understanding in terms of what these ancient giants were regarded as. So, first of all, Josephus said they had a bioengineering in terms of their bone structure that was completely different than humans. And of course, when you understand that these things were huge monsters, they would have to be engineered differently so that they could maintain, that extra size and weight and the muscle that would be required to propel those beings. And that they had these bones on view in museum-like settings even up to his time, and people would just walk through and leave in wonderment of it. And so as you take some of the other descriptions, and I'm just going to conflate from all over the world that sort of unite some of the same descriptions, you have kind of two sets of them for the most part that sort of come out of the Mediterranean region, and you have a blonde hair and blue-eyed version and a red hair and a hazel-eyed version. And these are the same descriptions that come out of the heroes and the giants like Atlas out of Atlantis. And they were considered before the flood to be somewhere between 20 and 40 feet tall. Now, in the book of Enoch, depending on which one that you're going to read in terms of the Giaz or Ethiopian version or the Aramaic version of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you get 300 ells or 300 cubits, and nobody really knows what an ell is, but a cubit, even on the smaller common cubit, would say 450 feet. So I would sort of lean to the Giaz version of an ell and just say we don't know what that is, but the common consensus is at least 20 to 40 feet tall and kind of like the size of the cedars of Lebanon. They would grow 36 to 50 feet tall, and it's one of the allegories used to describe the Amorites, which would have been a hybrid version out of the Bible. It doesn't say that they were that tall then, but it was using that sort of same allegory for a giant and the height of what some of these giants in the beginning may have grown to. After the flood, they would have been smaller, and I'll get to that. But they would have been, both before and after the flood, they were thought to have had a height to width ratio that is 2 to 1 versus the average human of 3 to 1. And so that's twice as wide. So these just weren't tall creatures. These were muscular, formidable, muscled, bioengineered different types of beings that were described as being very, very dexterous in Greek mythology and other legends, where they were fleet of foot and quick of hand and were the ultimate warrior in terms of their movement and their killing ability and their great size. And to kill them, typically, as like with Goliath out of the Bible or some other accounts of some of the kings that are killed, like Oreb and a few others, they take their head. And that's, again, part of the mythology, that comes with them, that you can only kill them by taking their head, which is exactly what David does in the Goliath account. And not only were they these monstrous creatures, but they had these voices that just sort of shook the earth as they spoke. Now, after the flood, we don't get descriptions of them as big as what they're thought to be for the Nephilim before the flood, but they're called Rephaim in the Bible after the flood. Again, going back to Rapha and Aim as the male plural, and again for a tribe of giants, but somehow distinct and likely created after the flood by the same types of individuals, although they would have received the punishment into the abyss for that crime, as did their co-conspirators before the flood. So you get a description of Goliath, which is the only one where we actually get a dimension where he's described as 6 cubits and a span. So a span is about 9 inches, but a cubit is measured a couple of different ways. One is a common cubit of about 18 inches, but I make the case in my book that these giants were the ones who usurped all of the kingships, both before and then again after the flood, and that Goliath would have been king of Gath. He was a Gittite where he came from. And that the size of a royal cubit is closer to 21 inches. And so using 21 inches or 1.5 feet for a cubit, you get a range of 9 feet 9 inches to 11 feet 3 inches, which is now in the zone of what you're talking about in terms of the size and the weight proportionality that would get to the description of this giant in Afghanistan, complete with having that total sort of warrior prowess about it and very, very difficult to kill. And what was interesting about David, he took 5 smooth slingshots with him because Goliath from Gath was part of the Philistine Pentapolis. And so there would have been at least 5 of those giant kings leading the Philistines in that battle, probably, and many other giants that were fortifying the armies, but he was prepared to take out all 5 kings at the same time. So somehow his shot found its way and was able to bring down the giant, but David had to go over and actually take his sword and take his head to actually kill him. But again, the details of the Afghanistan account would line up very, very well with the size of the giants in the time of David.
Let me read you the questions, the 2 I see here, unless there's any more. I'm going to read them. There's 3, actually. Let me read Tammy's question here first. Where it is. Why do they want to keep us from knowing about giants?
It's an awfully good question because this is a common history all around the world, but it's not commonly talked about it, and it's not part of, education. And usually people are sort of brushed off as being kind of crazy if they're out there talking about it. And for me, it's sort of part of that sort of whole conspiracy. And my book, to give you people, the listeners, a little bit better idea what I'm talking about, is when you have the main title of the Genesis 6 conspiracy, but the subtitle is how secret societies and the descendants of giants plan to enslave humankind. So now if you sort of get into that concept of what that conspiracy is, and that this is related to end time events, they're controlling the information. And they're making sure that when they absolutely come clean on the information, it's going to be on their timetable. But yet at the same time, they're keeping that evidence out there sort of hidden in plain sight within all of the entertainment, all of the literature that has been sort of ongoing that talks about these types of beings, that type of civilization, and has been ever since the time of the flood. So you get into whether or not it is Shakespeare who's writing about the same type of history, whether or not it's with Titanides and Oberon, who's the king of the fairies, which is uniquely tied into the Nephilim prehistory narrative and allegories, as is dragon. And you have, Ovides and Metamorphoses and all of the classics out of Greek history. And you have this common sort of MO right throughout history to keep this alive, but not sort of totally credible, so that we're not looking too deep in what's behind the curtain as to where are these descendants today, if they control the kingships, and they did, and do they have any relationship to the secret societies and to the royal families and the hidden elite that's pulling the strings behind the curtain?
This question, like I said, there's a few questions here. So this one's from Lion, and then I have to get to Tammy's other question, and then I'll get to the others here. First one from Lion. What does he think about the possibility of the Anunnaki Nibirites returning to Terra, meaning home, I assume, Earth, Terra,
yeah,
home, right?
Right. The planet Nibiru, was wrote extensively, by
X,
Sitchin.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Planet X, 13th planet, whatever you want to call it, and that it's sort of coming into range. And, some people in Christianity will look at that and say, well, they think that's the Wormwood thing that's coming. I don't think it is. I think this is something different. When you look at what Sitchin's talking about, this is talking about the return of the aliens. Mm-hmm. This is talking about a disturbing event with sort of untold consequences that we're not sure what is going to happen, except that they're going to be here and they're going to help us into another level of evolution, into godhood, into a new age, whatever you want to talk about. What's interesting is that from a biblical perspective, you have a same kind of ideology in the end time where you have two things that are going to happen with these type of beings. It's just that the Bible and other religions around the world would raise the level of these alien beings to more of a godlike status, as in fallen angel status from a biblical perspective, as just to very technologically advanced aliens. And so they're talking about similar events even in the end time. And so in Revelation 9, you get the opening of the abyss that's led by Abaddon with these scorpion-like beings that are coming and following him out of the abyss. These are the impassioned angels and the worst of the angels that were imprisoned for their violations against the laws of creation for creating the giants before the flood, and are rebellious angels, or the rebellious gods as they're known in polytheism, and will be released just before the midpoint of the last 7 years. And then at the midpoint of the last 7 years, you actually have a war in heaven where all of these angels are sent down to the earth and expelled, and they're going to have humankind fight for their existence against what people of the other side would say is the evil god of the universe, which is the god of the Bible. I don't have that view. I come on the other side. But that's sort of how those things sort of come together. So Nibiru is part of this sort of alien introduction, and whether or not it's an allegory of that planet coming, or it's just, a introduction to aliens as being actually out there and going to be partnering with us, but also telling us that there are other aliens that aren't after our interest, and that's where everybody's going to have to make a choice on what they believe. So I think that it is more about that. It's just about the arrival of these beings that were around in ancient history.
This is another question from Tammy that I mentioned. Did the giants eat smaller humans?
Well, they certainly did, at least according to many accounts. And because they were so big before the flood, I mean, they had this ferocious appetite, and it was hard to keep them fed and happy. And at some point in time, they start to turn on humankind and start to do, not only to persecute them, use them in rituals, drink their blood, and eat their flesh. So that is one of the crimes that are attributed to the Nephilim before the flood. And again, it's attributed to them again after the flood with the Rephaim and with a lot of the occult rituals at the high end in terms of the blood drinking, not necessarily the cannibalism, but I may not rule that out either.
This one's from Rockstar. Are they all men?
Well, we get most of the accounts of giants about males, just as the I am plural on Nephil or Rapha is the male plural. But you also have in Hebrew coming out an AH suffix, which is the female version. And so if you look at the word Gibberim, which is the translation for mighty ones that are describing these giants in Genesis 6:4 and how it's used throughout the flood, you also have Gibberah that is used in Hebrew that is describing a similar strong force, but with that female attribute. So from the etymology as we get Nephilim coming out, it suggests yes. In Greek mythology, we certainly get some names, as Shakespeare is using Titania from the Titanides that I talked about earlier, as the queen to Oberon, which is a fairy, which would just be an allegory for a giant. Tuatha De Danann would be the actual version of that Nephilim that he would be connecting Oberon to. So you get that understanding from Shakespeare that there were female giants before the flood. And what we're told is that there are some accounts, but very, very few. So my gut feeling is they were there. They may not have had the same numbers of creation as the males did, and that may have had an issue as to why they started to breed with humans to create hybrids, to create ones that could actually survive childbirth and deliver a baby. Because even with the original Nephilim, according to the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian version of the Old Testament, the mothers of the first generation giants could not deliver even, these giant babies that were the offspring of the sons of God and a human female. And so they had to slit the bellies open and sacrifice the women in favor of the demigods that they wanted to be the representatives on earth. So I think what we understand through all of this is that there probably were. And then after the flood, we actually get one definite account in the Bible of a Horim, which is a division of the Rephaim. So in Deuteronomy, without getting too much into the minutiae, in Deuteronomy 3, you understand that the Rephaim, or the giants goes back to Rephaim in Deuteronomy 3 for post-Diluvian giants. Names like the Emim or the Horim or the Hivim or the Anakim or the Zamzuzim and all the other names associated with these giant nations after the flood were actually part of the Rephaim, and those were just vernacular names for the different countries that they were in. And so in Genesis 36, you have a son of Esau who is named Eliphaz, and who marries a female by the name of Timnah, who is the daughter of Seir, which actually goes back to Hebrew to the word satyr, or those devil goat gods, as the source for the name. And Seir is sort of just a transliteration of satyr. And he is a Hori. So we get a definite account of a female giant in that account. And there's a few other ones, but they are very, very few and far between. But bottom line is, yes, there were female giants.
Okay, this question is a little over 10 minutes old, and I'm assuming it has to do with when we were talking about the size of the giants. And this comes from Soul Brava 19. If this is so, how could a regular old person just kill these monsters? Weren't people like an average of 5'0"-ish?
They were, and that's why these giants were able to usurp the kingships and set up their feudal system to to reign over the average human, because in the beginning they were just that big and powerful. So the only way you could take them down was in great numbers. And so if the giants had been able to populate as quickly as humans, we probably, wouldn't be out there in the numbers that we are today. So what I would say is the caller is in the chat room is absolutely right that they had such an advantage. It was very, very difficult for humans to take them down. One of the things that did the giants in both before and after the flood is they're power hungry. And so they would war with each other. And we get accounts of that, whether or not it's with Hercules going through the ancient world and killing the so-called evil giants. And in all other accounts around the world, you get giants fighting giants, just as we do in the Bible. And typically, the details that come out of those stories is that they would also kill their harem with them and, start limiting their ability to reproduce, to have these rival giants. So I think they did more damage to themselves than what the humans did in the beginning. But once humans were able to populate in greater numbers, they were able to get, a larger control over it, except that the power still remained with the elite class, which were the bloodlines of the Nephilim and the Rephaim after the flood.
We have another super chat donation from Justin T. I want to thank you, Justin, and the Blue Crew. Much love from me to the Blue Crew. And thank you all for being my moderators in this show. Okay, some more questions for you, Gary. Let's see what we got here. I passed a few while I got to this one to make sure I acknowledged him for sure. I'm looking. I'm trying to find a good question here for you. Okay, here you go. Lasha Senyuk. What does he think Wormwood means?
What do I think Wormwood means? Well, Wormwood is generally considered a star in Revelations. So what does that mean for the end time for us? And this is, going to cause enormous damage on the earth. It comes as part of one of the series of the seal judgments and the
Seven seals.
trumpet. Yeah.
The seven seals, opening the seven seals. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you're literally talking about associated with this set of catastrophes, like 25% of the population of the earth is going to be destroyed, and 25% of the earth. So it's something significant that it is part of. And what's interesting is that we have the possibility of nuclear devastation with the technology that we have in place today. And there was a huge nuclear malfunction in the Ukraine in the 80s, a place called Chernobyl. Chernobyl is Ukrainian for wormwood. And that's kind of one of those crazy kind of coincidences that I wonder with what's going on is, will we have some sort of breakdown of nuclear plants that is going to partially cause some of this damage that are in the seal judgments. So that's what I kind of think it is. But what we're told is in the Bible is it's a star. So a star can be an angel, it can be a planet, it can be an asteroid. But if it's Nibiru, if you have a planet come too close to our Earth, I mean, it is an extinction event. It's not 25%,
because of
right?
With the tides would be screwed with if you have a planet that comes close to us. Another massive gravity, right?
Yeah, so I'm thinking it's probably not that, and it can't even be too big of an asteroid, right? That because it could be an extinction event. So it's not going to be, that big of a thing that actually comes down and hits the Earth if it's an actual star. So I think it is, some sort of star sort of explosion type of thing from wars or sabotage or things like that.
Okay, Soul Brava 19. How much validity do you give to the Kandahar Giant story, which we talked about, and I mentioned how I talked to one of the people who was on the grounds when his fellow soldiers were being decimated, and you heard from Stephen Quayle, as a matter of fact.
Exactly. So typically on stories, and I get so many things thrown at me, and typically 99.99% are just not true. The details don't add up. The story's not congruent. But when I listened to that, and I listened to it a few times, I was so struck at the attention to detail, the attention to knowledge. They either were extraordinarily knowledge about giants, or they've been involved in giants in another occasion, or this was true. I mean, the details were just so bang on in terms of what my research is. It's one of those few that I would say, if giants are still around today, then this would be somewhat accurate. And there's a connection back to, the giants as they were being pushed out, that they would, be living in caves and in isolated areas, just as you have those stories that are told in North America about the red-headed giants. And just as you have these same stories from, the skulls that are discovered in Peru, they kind of backed into those same kind of areas. And caves also have this sort of occult understanding of having portals to other dimensions. And of course, with so many of these giants, whether it's the Tuatha Danann or the tribe of Danu or the Aryans, that they have this association with being able to go into another dimension, which is commonly understood as the underworld or Tartarus or the netherworld or Anwin in King Arthur tales. And again, it's King Arthur is just another tale of this ancient saga. Just has the allegories embedded in it, and you have so many examples that would go back to giants, and I talk about that in a number of sections in my book if people are interested. So I think there's a connection between them being isolated and in the caves with humans being so populous, and these things being absolutely you can't hide within society when you're that big, right? And they also have this extraordinary smell about them, which again goes right back to descriptions of what these giants were thought of in ancient times. So, like I say, it's just one of those things that, there's so many details that I would say that the story is probably accurate. I mean, I wasn't there, I can't verify it, but the details are just too stunning, too accurate, too well talked about and described that I'm pretty much convinced that there was a giant there.
All right, we got more for you. Soul Brother 19, another one from him. What is the relationship between First Nations / Native Americans and red-haired giants, since reports have giant skeletons found in North American burial mounds?
Well, some of the scientific research that's gone into this on a DNA testing has them going back to parts of Scotland and Ireland, and then sort of connecting that back to the Scythia region. And if people recall that what I was talking about a little earlier is that you have these giants that show up after the flood. And I was talking about Tuatha De Danann, and these are the same descriptions as what you get of the giants before the flood. And in a number of occult legends and history, you have these giants escaping Tartarus, and they were imprisoned in Tartarus for their rebellion, but they escaped from Tartarus, or the abyss, and it's an interchangeable word, in Scythia. And then from there, they go south into the Mesopotamia area where Gilgamesh stories come from, and into places like Saudi Arabia, where the Horim would come from, and they intermarried with them, and into Egypt, and into the Egyptian dynasties, and into the Covenant land. And this was the Mary-Anu, which is the Aryan nation name, which is, again, as I connected back earlier, talking about the same kind of people. They just have blonde hair, blue-eyed in one version that, ends up being more the Norse version. But you also have that red hair, hazel-eyed version that goes back to the Middle East. And what the common thought is that these giants were pushed out of the Middle East. Some went to Ireland, but some likely went to North America, and it's from the same strain, as the DNA trail takes you back to the same source.
This next one here from Rockstar. Is Wormwood supposed to come before the second coming of Christ?
Yes. And I look at Revelation as being a linear story, so it has a beginning and an end, just as the Bible is a linear story, starts in Genesis, ends in Revelation. So you're talking about this coming on in the first, with Wormwood showing up at about Revelation 6 and 7, right? And so you have the trumpet judgments and the abyss being open in Revelation 9, and you're not getting to the midpoint until about Revelation 12. And then from that point on, it's got descriptions as to what's going to happen in the last 3.5 years. And Jesus comes, I think, towards the middle point of the last 7 years, after the abomination, after Antichrist, who will present his dragon credentials and his pedigree as part of his whole sort of credentials to be the Messiah and the false Messiah, is crowned at the midpoint of the last 7 years, which is going to bring about the bowl judgments starting in Revelation 15. So this seems to be clearly a first 3.5 year event, probably within the first 1 or 2 years of the last 7 years. And for people, if they want to know where the 7 years comes from, that's Daniel 9:27, where Antichrist, who is rising through this process of negotiation of the New World Order and the universal religion, signs this New World Order covenant, and it's a 7-year covenant, or the last 7 years of the Book of Weeks that's set aside for everything to be fulfilled from a biblical perspective. So it would happen in how I understand Scripture from a literal perspective, and all the prophecies that point for rapture to just after the midpoint, with Jesus also coming back for a second Exodus, in the last 3.5 years, and also back for Armageddon. So there's 3 days of Jesus coming, just as Luke talks about the days of the Son of Man, not singular but plural. So that's where I would put it.
Lasha's next question is, why are there all sorts of paintings and drawings of fish-like people coming out of the sea?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. Just as some of them, if you go back to Sumerian mythology, you have Oannes, right? And he's typically depicted with that sort of fish look. But there's also an argument that some of the translations for the descriptions of them as being fish isn't quite accurate. It should be a little bit more reptilian, a little bit more snake-like, a little bit more to give people a good reference, a little bit more like an Ogdoad god. If you don't know what an Ogdoad god, just Google it. You'll get some reptilian pictures, and there'll be a few other figurines that are, of a crocodile and reptilian, and there's also like the bird ones in there as well. But in the feathered serpent, that is sort of where a lot of this ideology is coming from. And with, some of them had feathers and some of them didn't in some of these depictions. So where I'm going on this is that a lot of people think that these were serpent gods, which are heavily connected to the gods that are around the world with that sort of dragon or serpent type look, and as their offspring look just like them, which are the Nephilim, and as dragon creator gods in China would be depicted the same way, or the Nagas out of India would be depicted the same, just to give a few examples. And so these are also the same as what we would know as the seraphim angels. As you take that back to Hebrew, that's seraph, with I am as the male plural again. And these were fiery serpent angels. They had the faces of a serpent. And these are the angels that are depicted as watchers in Daniel 4 and in 1st Enoch. So there's this common heritage about these gods that either have a serpentine look or ones that come out of the water that have more of this fish-like look, like in the Dagon ones. And in other ones, you actually have them with serpent tails and human bodies as you get into some of the sort of the Greek versions of that same sort of depictions. But again, you have this sort of serpent commonality. So the short answer is, I think those fish depictions are more serpent depictions, and that would be more common to the most common type of god in prehistory.
Here's another one for you. This is from Tammy George. Do you think giants had a mindset or brain intelligence as we do?
Well, I think they would have had to have a significant intelligence, whether or not they were significantly more intelligent or not than humankind. That's debatable. Certainly, they had a larger brain capacity. And you look at those elongated heads; those are significantly bigger than a human cranium. So there's no way you can bind a head and create more volume. So they had bigger brain capacity. The question gets to be is how much of that brain was being used, just as we use very little of our brain today. So size is necessarily an indication, but it is one of the indicators. Now if we look at the technology that was developed before the flood, and with things like pyramids and Machu Picchu and all of these underground cities, and people know what I'm talking about with these inexplicable, unaccounted for levels of building that we can't even do today. And then we look closer into their accounts, and they're talking about all of this magic or all of this power. These were the ones that were controlling it. It was the giants who ruled the kingdoms that were controlling this knowledge. So they had to have enough intelligence to operate that and to be able to learn that level of science. And so I would say they were intelligent, but what I also would say is that they were arrogant and they lacked wisdom. And in every account, that arrogance, that hubris, that overreach, and narcissism becomes one of their downfalls. And they weren't able to overcome that with wisdom to be able to discipline that knowledge and that intelligence to not, be as much of a destroyer of themselves as what the humans would have been against the giants.
InfoWars WikiLeaks. What do you think the dragon represents in Revelations?
Well, the dragon is called the serpent and is called Satan. So Satan is who is being talked about as the dragon in Revelation 12. If you're talking about the beast that comes out of the sea, it's like a dragon hydra. It has many heads. So this would be the beast empires that are the great empires reigned over by the Nephilim, serpent-type bloodlines from the serpent-type gods that created these empires after the flood, empires like Egypt, empires like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and the end-time empire. So if that's what the caller is asking about in terms of the dragon, I would say that multi-headed beast is the beast empire and a serpent empire, because it's all the allegory is the same and consistent in the Bible when it's talking about these kinds of concepts. And so I think Antichrist will have a pedigree that he actually takes back to the Nephilim as part of that dragon bloodline. And understand, a serpent with wings is a dragon. So when Satan is called a serpent and a dragon and the devil, they're not creating different looks for him. They're giving him the same description sort of consistently all the way through.
Another one from Lasha. Is it possible that the feathered serpent could actually be a depiction of electromagnetic energy or lightning?
Well, you could get that picture because these were shining opalescent beings, and they absolutely would light up a huge area. So, that light would be associated with the gods. And even with the original Nephilim, they had their, even though they were more, from half physical and half spirit of how they're created, they were described as having eyes that would light up a room. And so they were known as the shining ones as well. So I think that's just one of those traits that was sort of passed on to them. And if somebody wants to get sort of a look as to what I'm talking about, and understand this might be a little bit more diluted in terms of that serpentine look. If you look at a King Tut museum, for example, and you have usually a depiction of or a statue in there that will have Akhenaten, or just Google Akhenaten and have a look at that picture. This is a dragon king, an offspring of the ruling class that reigned, arguably, depending on which chronology you want to use, somewhere between 1200 and 1400 BC. And he has that long protruding chin, those high cheekbones, those large wraparound eyes, and those elongated skulls that, they wore those caps to cover. But there are depictions with him without having that usual pharaonic cap, which is also usually depicted as a cobra, just as the Nagas were the Sanskrit word for cobra or snake, and that's where the name Naga comes from. So I think that when we look at what that shining aspect is that people associate with these gods or with these angels, that's just part of that nature of that opalescent being that they just shone like crazy. So you would confuse that with lightning or maybe a star-type presence or whatever you want to call it, electrical, but it would have that sort of effect for sure.
I'm seeing a couple of people here asking about the Naga, N-A-G-A. Can you explain that?
Yeah, Naga were a set of gods in Hinduism. And they have a very much a cobra-type look. So they had a serpent-type look. And they produced offspring into a priest class and a warrior class. And the offspring not only worship these gods, but again, they had a similar type of look. And so they were a little bit lower than, gods like Varuna and some of the parent gods. So they would be very much like what I would call the Watchers or the fallen angels, like Azazel, that are described in Shemyaza, that's described in First Enoch. But these are a set of gods that brought wisdom and civilization to the people of India, just as you have that same story told around the earth.
Now, let me ask you this. I figured since the flat earth people always look as Genesis 6 as being proof of the so-called flat earth, which I do not believe, and I've seen so many videos, I've listened to so many people, there's nothing about that conspiracy that makes any sense. It's just so delusional. What do you think about it?
Well, it's a very, very hot topic, and amazingly amongst the Christian group, but it sort of expands beyond that. I'm agnostic on it. I have a few issues in terms of my understanding of flat Earth, but I remain more agnostic, but leaning against. I can't answer certain things with what happens with what we can physically see, whether or not it's some of the eclipses or it's 24-hour sunshine and darkness on the other end. And so what I do know is something is going around something, and to have any of this sort of makes sense. So, and all of that sort of goes against what the typical flat earth theology is. And that's the reason why I'm kind of skeptic is you see this imagery of this flat earth as it goes back into a lot of the occult sciences coming out of the Middle Ages. So I'm a little bit concerned about where some of that may have spilled over and influenced Christianity. Now, you can look in the Bible and you can get references to, allegories like the four corners of the earth and lots of things that will suggest.
Exactly one of the quotes they use. That's right.
Yeah. But you don't get enough to, in my opinion, to sort of make that conclusion. So, like I say, I'm open to the idea, but I do know something is going around something. Either we're going around the sun or the sun is going around us. And it's not that I put my faith in NASA or science, because I know where that knowledge is sponsored from and what the agenda is. And it certainly doesn't have the average human in their interest, or certainly Christians in their interest. So,
Aaron Johnson asks, what is his opinion regarding Rh negative blood type and biblical history?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So we have about 15% of the population that has Rh negative blood. In my book, I don't specifically reference Rh negative because we don't have that smoking gun proof that this has anything to do with the Nephilim or the Rephaim. But there's a lot of things that do point in that direction. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so when we look at the royal families who claim they have the genealogies that take their bloodlines back to the Nephilim and back to the gods as their divine right to rule, they have heavy Rh negative bloodlines. So like the Windsor family is heavily O negative, for an example. And they intermarried as much as they could through the years to keep that bloodline as pure as possible. But the more you intermarry, the more diseases you get, like hemophiliac disease and Habsburg jaw and things like that. So they have to bring in outside bloodlines that may have very low concentrations of their DNA in their bloodline, just to refresh the bloodlines to keep some of the diseases out. But essentially, they do try and continue to intermarry. And this goes back to this whole idea that was popularized by the Rosicrucians and adopted by the Nazis, who believe in a concept called Vril. And Vril is the concept of something in the blood that if they can backward engineer, they could recreate the Nephilim and the Rephaim from backward engineering the genetics of blood to get there. They haven't been able to do that, but that's what the Nazis were essentially trying to recreate with the new man, was a new Nephilim, in this case a blonde-haired, blue-eyed version of it. No coincidence there. There just aren't coincidences in history. It's just these things happen regularly and commonly, and all in the same sort of theme. So it's thought, though, that this Rh negative is foreign to humans.
Yes, that's the consensus, right? That's
the consensus, and that it was somehow added to it, except that when you get into the sort of the details of it, is that it's actually missing an antigen that, as opposed to adding, right? So you can't what you can't do is sort of get the cart ahead of the horse on this thing, but you have to understand that the blood is created through the DNA. And that's what gets added. So they believe in something called the gene of Isis, which Isis is a mother goddess.
Yeah, Isis and Osiris.
Yes. And, again, you connect that back into the secret societies, and that's why Vril is that concept that comes out that sort of overlaps into all of this. And it's that gene that would produce those bloodlines. And so, and again, most people, in today's age, if they don't know a little bit of history or why, when I got married, I have to do a blood test to make sure I was compatible with my wife, is because, negative blood isn't compatible with positive blood, because, the baby will die. And so you have to have drugs to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so all of this points back to being this bloodline that's introduced that is thought to be from the descendants of the giants. And it's, they're looking for it in so many different ways, which is why they're making so much of these databases that are out there, whether or not it's for blood banks, whether or not it's for genealogies, whether or not it's for DNA. And what they're trying to do is get ready for the time where they want to have this great sort of harmonic conversion, because they want to unite the spark of the divine, which is that spark that comes from the immortal spirit of the fallen angels or the gods that was passed on to their offspring on earth, so that they can evolve and regain their immortality that they had once been created before God took it away in Genesis 6:3. And so all of this has this consistent sort of web that is weaving around it, that is all sort of working directionally in the same direction. But like I say, we don't have that smoking gun proof that goes back to the Nephilim. And then there's other people think it might go back to other types of beings that would have, mated with human beings, whether it's Cro-Magnon man or whoever else you want to bring in on that. So there's a lot of different theories on that. But what is known is that Rh negative is foreign, and somehow it becomes intermixed in the human blood. And I think that's through the hybrids.
Another question for you about DNA is, what do you think about junk DNA? As you were saying earlier, nothing is random. Everything has a reason. For instance, that's what you said. Essentially, you can make an argument for why everything happens, and so
it hasn't been activated as all. It's not junk. It's there for a purpose. We just don't know what that purpose is, and we don't know what it takes to turn those things on to let it do. And so it may go back and again reflect that that's additional DNA that's part of humankind that was also there with the Nephilim, that gave them some of the extraordinary powers that people accredit them to have had. And Rh negative people are known to have significant extra qualities that most people don't seem to know about. So when I talk about what those qualities are, research shows that higher intelligence of an IQ of 135 plus, better analytical skills, better intuitive abilities, more psychic abilities, larger heads, larger eyes, have a lower body temperature, higher percentage of blonde and red hair. So that comes back again, higher percentages of blue and green or hazel eyes, better vision, increased sensitivity to light. That's why vampires in that allegory that goes back to Dracula, which is, connected back etymologically to dragon, and Vlad the Impaler was a descendant of the Scythians, as you take his bloodlines back. And by the way, Prince Charles says his genealogy goes back to Vlad the Impaler, and he was a member of the Ordo Draconis starting in 1400. And I go on and on and on about the consistency to
keep
allegories.
Going on, please. Yeah. I love that. When you mentioned Vlad the Impaler, that's where we got Dracula from.
Yes, absolutely. And he had red hair, hazel eyes, pale skin, was considered an Oberon of the Tuatha De Danann, which is basically an overlord and a ruler. And he takes his DNA, his genealogies back to the Scythians, as again, as the red hair, hazel-eyed versions. And he has these cobra fangs of the serpent, or the Naga, and he drinks blood to regain his immortality. And the allegory is with Dracula is that this is the enemy of Christianity. So in the matriarchal and the patriarchal bloodlines, they have an allegory. Dragon for the patriarchal or the male bloodline, fairy for the matriarchal bloodline. And again, if people just take a step back and just think about how we're inundated with all of these allegories and imagery all of the time, and then you start to say and connect what I say, nothing is there by coincidence and everything is there for a purpose and by design, then you can start to peel back the encoded languages that they're hiding all of their genealogy and their history and what they intend to do in plain sight. So when we talk about these Rh negative bloodlines, to come full circle again, because I tend to get going on these impassioned rants, which I love to do, we learn that the heaviest concentrations of Rh negative blood are in kind of the southwest and France areas, and you get concentrations there of as high as 20 or 25% Rh negative blood, which is where you had an epicenter of these giant bloodline ruling class kings moving out of the Middle East and setting up their new dynasties in Europe after they were pushed out of the Middle East. And the most heavily concentrated grouping of people who have Rh negative blood are the Basques, again, living in the same area. And if you dig into them to any certain extent, they have a mythology that they actually believe that they derive from a people called Homo Atlantis, and that they were the ones after the flood to settle Egypt, Sumeria, Scythia, and northern Spain and south of France after the flood. And even their language goes back to an Aryan pre-flood type of language. So, and they were there before these bloodlines moved out of the east, and they believe they have a more pure set of bloodlines, at least in their ruling class, than the other royals of Europe. And that's why they had a conflict, because the other bloodlines thought they were arrogant, and they had a falling out, and they basically pushed them out, which is why you had a lot of diaspora of the Basque people around the world.
Frankie Zomboy wants to know who was imprisoned for 70 generations, because the Watchers were imprisoned until Judgment Day. Is 70 generations up?
Well, a lot of people think that we're very much closing in for that period. And so typically, I mean, we're referring to Azazel on those 70 generations. And Azazel, I think, is Abaddon in the Bible, or Apollyon that comes out of the abyss. And you don't get an angel called Azazel in the Bible, but you do get the scapegoat, which is a second goat that is sacrificed on the Day of Atonement. That goes back to the Hebrew word Azazel. And this is the one who had all of the sins of the antediluvian world put upon him, because he's the one who taught war to not only the giants but to humans in the antediluvian world, and taught most of the ancient knowledge to the people, even though there are other gods and angels that are also accredited for doing it. But he is the scapegoat, which is why in the degraded form after the fall, he's depicted as a satyr or a goat god in a lot of the images, because all the fallen angels were degraded in status to a certain degree from their seraphim and watcher status. Now, there would have been more that were put into the abyss than just Azazel, but he would be the king of the abyss, and he was known as the leader of the host of the angels in First Enoch that went into the abyss along with his host that had followed him. Whereas Satan, who was the true leader, Azazel would have been his right-hand man in the rebellion. He was reduced to Satan status to be an adversary. He'll go to the abyss at the end of Armageddon and then escape. And then after that, start another war, and then goes to the lake of fire to be destroyed. So that's what most people sort of walk around thinking, that 70 generations is coming up now, and which is why we're seemingly ramping up, just like as in the days of Noah with technology and knowledge, and things are coming in place to put a new world order in place of a world government and a universal religion, where all of the end time events of the last 7 years that Revelation is very, very descriptive about, talks about.
Have you seen the movie Ex Machina?
I have not.
It's a great movie, and it goes to show what would happen once we create a very conscious artificial intelligence. And the assumption is that once this conscious life is created, this artificial conscious life, that it traps the humans, kills one, the creator, and goes off to live on amongst the rest of the humans. And that's where the story ends. Great movie, but I think the point it's come across is kind of like what Kaczynski was talking about, that the dangers of technologies that we're facing, the dangers of computers and everything being so much easier and out there for everybody. 20 years ago, look at the technology we had just 20 years ago or 30 years ago to now. We've changed so drastically. Internet speeds are so much higher. You could stream things in much higher definition, much faster than ever before. You have Fios, you got Dish technology, Sirius XM for cars, you name it. YouTube, part of me thinks that the Unabomber was actually right when he talks about the problems of humanity when it revolves around technology.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. And I can only think of two other scenarios like what we're going through right now. This rapid acceleration and advancement of knowledge and technology that's leading into, a conversion of quantum mechanics and AI for who knows what reasons. Typically, we all know from science fiction movies what happens when we let the technology get out of control. But it is happening in a manner that I could only compare of one to was during the the rise of Hitler and the Nazis.
Yes.
You have this country in 1933 when Hitler takes power that is basically bankrupt. It has no army. It has no real industrial complex. And within a few short years, they're developing a blitzkrieg strategy, which revolutionizes war. They're developing tanks, which are still the bases, with the Panzers and the Tigers that are still used as sort of the base technology to build tanks today. They build rockets. They build jet engines, single-winged airplanes, radar is not able to detect, and on and on and on with all of these advancements in such a short period of time. And they had this occult relationship where, when they were asked, they were basically saying that they were being fed this information from these entities. And it's just an inexplicable sort of rise of technology that, in Operation Paperclip was sort of wrapped up and brought over to the United States to try and continue some of that. And I wonder whether or not that is just an extenuation of that. And then I look at what the times were described all around the world with this great technology and level of intelligence and capabilities that they had. I mean, when people look at, the Atlantis mythology, which is the one most people are most aware of, which is why I tend to use it more often, you have so many of these depictions of all of this technology in many of the versions that this was just an extension of the 7 sacred sciences that the secret societies were born out of, and incidentally in the same period as when the Nephilim are being created. And the development of that knowledge by the patriarchs of Cain and Enoch, son of Cain in particular, as opposed to Enoch, son of Jared, of the Seth line. And this is the knowledge that they're developing as a base, and it's the same level of arts and sciences that we have today that marries up with the Watchers and the fallen angels and the gods and or the aliens, depending on how you want to address that group of people, that accelerates this knowledge very, very quickly, that brings about the apocalypse of water. And this is the same thing that we're having going on today. So I think it's very appropriate when Jesus is talking about the signs of his coming and what the signs of the end time are going to be. Mayans, as you would have them, after the flood or before the flood?
I'm assuming it's after the flood.
Okay, after the flood. Okay, just wanted to be clear on that. Well, I still think we have the Quiché Maya that were part of settling Central America and into North America after the flood. You have so many accounts, whether or not it's the White Snake Clan that goes back to this island in the Atlantic, or you have Aztlan of the Aztecs, or you have out of the Popol Vuh for the Quiché Maya, where you have Olmecs and Toltecs and Mixtecs, and the Mayans, who are the people that were saved by the Atlanteans to repopulate after the Earth. So within that group, I think those are still the descendants of those survivors of Atlantis that settled in Central and North America after the flood. But you also had another class out of the Popol Vuh called Xibalba. And who the Xibalba are very much like a Nephilim type of being, but more in that sort of falcon or raven look that you would have the Tengu as, and or some of the Anunnaki that are depicted as, and or Horus, just as Horus had offspring that had people looking like them as well. Well, these were the Xibalba, as they're described in the Popol Vuh, and it says they went to the other world. So, and they were very much described as other types of Nephilim around the world. So, and that seems to be post-Diluvian, because the Popol Vuh is the holy book that was salvaged through oral traditions and then recorded after the Spanish had conquered the Maya and the Aztecs.
Who do you think, or let me read this correctly. Who does the guest think the Antichrist is, and will there be an Antichrist? Or will there be an Antichrist? The second part.
Well, in the Bible, we're told there's going to be many Antichrists, but there's only sort of one, the Antichrist. So one of the things I like to warn Christians about particular is don't get out over your ski tips here in terms of pointing at every president that comes along, or some individual that's becoming more famous in Europe or something is necessarily being Antichrist. There can only be one, but there will be many vying ones. And there's these bloodlines that go all over the world. So you're going to have competing bloodlines for Antichrist all over the world. So when you look at, let's say, just as one example, and I won't go too far into the minutiae of all the different families, around the world, but you have the dragon creators, which are, again, the same as the seraphim, angels, and the serpent gods all around the world, who create the Shah dynasty, who creates the dynastic kings through China that the Li family comes from. And you understand that Japan goes back to the Li bloodline, just as there was a Li in there leading communist China before Japan. These bloodlines are in place and are all vying for world control, because whoever is going to be Antichrist is going to be king of the world. right? So they're all vying, just that they have all throughout history.
King of the world or king of the other anti-world, or what is the other world called?
The underworld?
Yes, thank you.
Both. So that's what they want to have. So we're going to see many antichrists vying. And in the West, the secret societies and the bloodlines say that they keep 3 antichrists prepared at all times. Like they would have this happen before the ordained times, but they will accept the ordained times if they have to. But they're always prepared with their antichrist figures. So you've got several different bloodlines that are always sort of competing for that. And so, I think you have to look at, Antichrist from a biblical perspective is going to come out of, either the Roman or the Greek Empire. So sort of that geographical area of around Europe as from a Christian perspective. But you also have to understand that out of the Hindu bloodlines, they believe their Messiah is going to be Lord Maitreya, or the new Buddha. So you might want to look for, a possible figure, out of the Singh or the Khan bloodline as another set of bloodlines. And then you have the Mahdi for the Shia, so which are Muslims. And you have all of these bloodlines around the world that are competing. But in the West, you have to keep an eye on the Windsor bloodline because of just the purity of that bloodline that intermarried with the Sinclair, not the Sinclair bloodline, the Stuart bloodline. So that's one significant bloodline. I would keep an eye on Sinclair bloodlines as well, because that is the St. Clair or the Rollo bloodline that goes back to the Norse gods. And they intermarried with the European bloodlines all throughout the last 2,000 years. So you have the scion of the bloodlines coming in from the St. Clair families. And that, goes back to Rollo expropriating Normandy.
It wasn't that the last name that was used in the Da Vinci Code? St. Clair?
Yeah, it is. Well, and the St. Clair is the Scottish transliteration of St. Clair. St. Clair is the treaty that was negotiated with the King of France with Rollo after he won the battle and expropriated Normandy, and the descendants who of that royal family changed their name to St. Clair, which transliterated into St. Clair, who are the ones who built Rosslyn Chapel and started Freemasonry after the fall of the Knights Templar, just as Henry de Payon was a battle partner of Hugh de Payon, one of the founders and one of the hidden members of the founders of the Knights Templar, just as, Du Bouillon and Anjou were a couple of the major bloodlines that go back to the Merovingians and back into history. So as we talk about some of these bloodlines, so those would be some names that you would want to look at. Plantagenet comes out of the Anjou. You have the De Payon, De Bouillon, and Anjou family that lived in the Lorraine region. And the cross of Lorraine has 2 crosses, which is signifying 2 major bloodlines. One's Nephilim. I have a great 3-part series on that for if somebody wants documents on that, on commentaries that I do. And you may also want to look at that as they married into the Habsburg dynasty. It became the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, and we're carrying the King of Jerusalem title, which is a title Antichrist will take when he's crowned in the temple in Jerusalem. And that all comes through their blood genealogies going back to the princes of Jerusalem that were intermarried into the Merovingian bloodlines, where Jerusalem was awarded to the Benjamites by Joshua in the time of the Exodus, and those are the King Saul bloodlines that they're referencing to that King of Jerusalem title. And the King of Spain, King Philippe, son of Juan Carlos, who also held the King of Jerusalem title. King Philippe currently holds that title. So this is a title to watch for where it's going to end up as we close up in on the end time, who's got that title, because that's usually the leading candidate for the Antichrist title from these European bloodlines. Everybody thinks it's likely going to go to Prince William next, but I think that's a little bit more speculation. You might want to look at, the Geezer name, the De Bruce name, which married into the Stuart clan, the Champagne family, St. Clair de Guiser is another sort of scion bloodline that you may want to look at. But the Bourbon one currently out of Spain would be the likely candidate at this point. But we want to be careful. We won't know until this individual starts to negotiate this new world order that I like to call the new Nephilim world order, NWO, where we're going to have world government. That'll be the one who eventually will become Antichrist.
Has he found a correlation between the Vikings and giants? Meaning you.
Yes, and I detail that throughout my book. And so again, they have the same prehistory. You have the same type of gods, and they produce giants. And these giants begin to become the kings, and these are the bloodlines that the Rollo family that produces the De Bruces, King Bruce of Scotland, and the St. Clair family, and also another one that people would recognize out of history would be William the Conqueror, who invades England and retakes the throne for the Normans or for the Viking bloodlines back in 1066. And of course, then it's going to intermarry into the Plantagenet, and that's where that title starts to move in at about the time of King John and King Richard.
How do you... Okay, I'm going to read this the way it's written, and then we could translate it to meaning you. How does he think Nimrod became a giant? So basically, what do you think? How do you think? Yes. How do you think that Nimrod became a giant?
Well, it's a great question again. So I'm not necessarily convinced that Nimrod was Nephilim, or Rephaim as he would be after the flood. What we do know is that the Nephilim were created usually by male gods or angels who mated with human females. That doesn't mean that they couldn't have changed themselves into females and mated with males, but we don't really get any accounts of that. But I'm open to that possibility. So Nimrod's father is Cush, right? And son of Ham and son of Noah. So we have his genealogy. But it says he became a Nephilim. So there's a couple of ways we can look at that. One is that it doesn't say, and this is the most important point here, it doesn't say he became Nephilim. It says he became a mighty one, which goes back to the word Gibor or Gibborim, which is used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4. But Gibborim is used 158 times in the Old Testament in Hebrew. Sometimes it means an angel. Sometimes it just means a normal man. Sometimes it means the strength of God. So you have to be careful that it fits the narrative. So what it says is Nimrod became a mighty one on earth and a mighty hunter and a mighty warrior, not necessarily a giant. But yet he has been associated with giants because he was such a great warrior and such a great hunter. So if he starts off at human, then how does he become a giant-like individual? Well, secret societies in their ancient history, and I'm going to bring a lot of this into play right now in terms of what their beliefs are, don't necessarily agree he was a giant, but he was like a giant. Now, they proclaim Nimrod as the first Grand Master of Masonry after the flood. And what happens is he partners with an individual, according to Albert Mackey in the History of Masonry. Great book if you get your hands on it. It's got not all, but a number of the ancient oral polychronicon traditions that make up the Masonic history. But they say that Hermes finds the two pillars of Lamech. Some legends say Enoch, but I think it's Lamech who makes the pillars, which has all of the knowledge and the religion stored in these two pillars, and the location of that knowledge stored under the pyramids that he takes back to Babel. And if he becomes a giant, it's thought that this is the knowledge that was from before the flood that Hermes brings to Nimrod that is used to help turn him into a Rephaim or like a giant. But what he does do is what we do is he uses this knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower. And the threat is so great, and that the knowledge being used, and it's literally, paraphrasing what the Bible says, that speaking as one language as one people, if this continues, nothing will be prevented from them from doing. So you have the disbursement of the languages from there, and Nimrod stays in the Sumeria or Shinar, which is Sumer, or in the Eridu region, and continues to develop the mystical religions. But this is the knowledge that was developed by Enoch, son of Cain, down through his progeny to Lamech, which has Tubal-Cain, and all these are patriarchs and founders of the original Masonic societies before the flood, that this knowledge marries with this knowledge from the gods that accelerates the world. So if Nimrod had access to that knowledge, he probably had capabilities of doing something on some sort of DNA manipulation to make that happen if he actually became giant-like or enhanced in some way. And when we look at all the different creatures that you have running around in prehistory, whether it's chimera or centaurs or Pegasus or Cyclops or dragons or lion men or elephant people or little fairy people and mermaids, or sirens as they're called in First Enoch, this is not an unknown concept that some sort of DNA manipulation was likely going on with the technology that they had developed before the flood. So that would be how.
Have you watched The Curse of Oak Island, where they trace the Knights Templar journeys to the island? I'm reading that as word for word.
Yeah, I watched a few of those shows, but what I know is it's a great detective story. They'll find maybe little bits of clues. They won't find a whole bunch. That's because the knowledge and the treasures that were taken there by the Sinclairs, which is the knowledge, much of the knowledge, I wouldn't say all, but much of the knowledge that was excavated and found with the Templar excavation under Jerusalem Temple, which also they got their genealogies where the Princes of Jerusalem genealogies were found to connect back in for the pedigrees for the Debulion families and the Peons and the Merovingians and all of them. They trace that back, but that knowledge was scurried away from France over to Scotland under another Henry Sinclair, the one who built Rosalind Castle, another one who starts Freemasonry, and they take that across the flood or across the ocean and hide it there. But they moved it at some point thereafter, and they kind of keep moving it around. And I was listening to an adept of the Templars one time, and he was basically saying the reason why they're not going to find anything until the secret societies want to bring it out is because after the stuff that was moved in Oak Island that they're looking for, that and other treasures were moved with agreements that they made with Native Americans on the reservations and buried there, where governments don't have any rights to that access. And they used the knowledge to get across the ocean over to North America because they had this great fleet of ships that were sailing all around the world that they were basically keeping secret. And if you look at what Christopher Columbus did in 1492 when he sails across on the Santa Maria, what flag is he flying? He's flying the Templar flag.
How does Noah fit into all this? Is the flood he lived through the flood that killed the giants?
Yes, he is, and it's to me it's the same flood that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's just that you're having a story about Upnuptition and all of his family, and they're just archetypical Nephilim that survived the flood as a parallel account of the same set of events. But the Noah flood is the one that killed the original Nephilim. Trouble is, though, is giants show up after the flood, and what we're not given within the Bible is a smoking gun verse as to how that happens. for me, second incursion is the most likely way that this happens, is that you have angels that weren't put in the abyss because it was only the worst and the impassioned ones that I talked about on the front end of the show. So you had all these other angels still out. If there was a second incursion, it would be some of those angels who recreated Rephaim, again, probably either in Sodom and Gomorrah or at Mount Hermon. But if they did, they would have been sent to the abyss as well. But also remember, there's still fallen angels that haven't been sent to the abyss, and they still influence the world. The other way is somehow on an ark, and there's lots of ark stories, and most of them are saying, well, this is just a Sumerian version of the Noah story. They're only similar on a macro account, but the details are significantly different. Beginning with, they're talking about Nephilim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Another classic example that people might be aware of to sort of underscore my point would be the Greek version, where they call it the Greek Noah, who is Deucalion, and his wife Pyrrha, or Noria, as it's used in some other versions. But Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, and Prometheus is either a Nephilim or a Titan god. Either way, Deucalion's another Nephilim. And so it's just another Nephilim survival story. So I would say my fallback position would be that second bucket would be somehow on an ark, or somehow with the help of aliens or gods, either off the earth, in the earth, but somehow with some sort of help. Some people think on the ark somehow. That's my least favorite one. If they did, they would have been, somehow the wives of Noah's sons probably would have had to have been Nephilim or Nephilim DNA to make that happen. It's possible, but my least favorite position. So I somehow on the other arc is kind of the three buckets I put it into.
What about gold and its connection to the Anunnaki?
Well, it's got its connection to all the royal families. It's got its connection to all the different religions around the world. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Central America or China or Japan or Europe or wherever. I mean, gold is this very, very important commodity that is, I think, was used in the technology. And, whether or not it is the Anunnaki version where they're mining it, and then creating new technology or to maintain technology, I think it is one of the key things that allows you to do travel in ways that we can't sort of imagine except through science fiction today, whether or not that's through wormholes, portals, on machines that have the ability to, go to warp speed. Again, sort of getting into that advanced sort of technology, just as I think crystals work into that same sort of aspect, because they're sort of kind of synonymous in their applications and usage as we get that coming out of prehistory through the various types of legends and magic and things like that.
What do you think of Zecharia Sitchin's findings?
Well, it's very interesting, and he translated directly from the ancient glyphs, right? So he had that ability to do that. I mean, there's other translators that disagree with his versions of some of those translations, but no matter what, directionally, whether or not you agree with his translation or not, directionally, it's directionally in the right direction. So, but I would be caution to accept his version of the translations word for word, because he was a Gnostic and a Freemason. And typically, they're the ones who are controlling the information or corrupting some of that information for their own purposes.
What does he know about the Kensington runestone? Runestone, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what he knows about the runestone.
Where does
Can't
he
answer that.
think the Templars got all their gold? Gold, actually.
Well, from a variety of areas. So
Pillaging and plundering, right?
Pillaging and plundering would be one aspect. Yeah. The excavations that they did underneath the temple. But you have to understand that they became the most powerful organization the world had ever known. It was this organization that was more than just a warrior class of priests. I mean, it was a secret society, yes. It sponsored all the modern secret society organizations, yes. But they were also an extraordinarily wealthy organization that founded modern banking. And they lent money to the thrones and indebted them. They created the check concept, deposits. They would allow people to give them money, let's say in Paris. They travel to Jerusalem, and then they get their money back there because they had all of these locations, and these locations were donated to them by the royal families. They were, I mean, they make the modern corporation, I think, small by comparison.
Okay. What does he think the gods of Olympus were actually real gods?
I think they were fallen angels. That's what I think. Again, I look at the various accounts of prehistory as a polytheist lens of the monotheist history in the Bible. And I look at all the different pantheons around the world, and they're all stunningly the same. And you have a set of parent gods above, and then you have, like with the Olympus gods, which is centered around typically 7. And in the Greek version, you have, Zeus and his 7 gods.
God
and
of gods,
yeah,
Zeus, God of gods, yep.
Yeah. So, but above that is, was Kronos as the parent god,
the god
right?
of time.
And Zeus overthrew him. So, I think they were just fallen angels.
Do you think aliens could be the spirits of the free Nephilim?
I think they have a connection to them. I'm not necessarily convinced they are what we would sort of call the Nephilim. So what the bodiless spirits of the Nephilim, which are the demons, these are a spirit being, and they need a body to interact with the world. And as Jesus describes them, they live in desert places, and they thirst while they're in those wastelands, thirsting to have a body so that they can interact in the world. And so that's why they try and possess people. But if you're possessing someone, you're suppressing the host spirit, and it's not a symbiotic relationship. So there's no way they could be able to create technology, fly these spaceships, and do the things that aliens do. But I think the technology that is trying to be developed is going to be trying to create either clone bodies or some sort of technology, as in transhumanism or robotics, to house these demon spirits. Now, I said I think that they're related to them. You could look at it from being those angels who are outside of the abyss that didn't violate the laws of creation, and who have a changeling capability that could change them into anything. That may be part of it as well, but I think there's a greater sort of understanding to what's going on with the alien sort of mythos. And, if I look at, and people may be familiar or remember what I was talking about earlier in the show with the fairies. Well, the fairy mythos has 4 different classifications of fairies. You have the godlike ones who come from other planets. They procreate to create the second one, which are the Tuatha De Danann. And then you have the demon spirits, which are the bodiless spirits of those giants. And then you have the elementals. The elementals are the little people that are separated and divided into 3 categories. And I'll make this quick. In the one category is the ugly ones. So you have, hobbits and elves and dwarves, and all of these little people have specific jobs in prehistory. Just like different classifications, like the good-looking ones and the mischievous ones. But these ones look after the technology and also the genealogies and the knowledge. That's their role. So that's why you see, let's say in Lord of the Rings, where you've got the dwarves who live in the mountains, and they create the weapons for the gods and the Nephilim type creatures that are in Lord of the Rings. And it's an antediluvian story. It's just got a Norse overlay on it. And so when you look at one classification that are in the ugly ones are the gnomes. And these ones are ones who have flying machines, and they fly through portals or fairy shays, and they kidnap people. Pardon me?
Vermanas?
Possibly, but not from the fairy lore in terms of what they're called. But these ones, in that classification, there is one of these gray fairies that is known as the Grey Neighbours in Scotland, but they're known as the Grey ones. And I put two descriptions of these kidnappings in my book that have come down through history, and there's lots out there. But if you didn't know that I was talking about a fairy abduction with their spaceships and things, and their flying machines and their great technologies, you would swear it was a gray alien abduction. And these fairies are created by the gods in prehistory. And again, the fairy mythos is on all continents around the world. Obviously not Antarctica, but we haven't really found what may be hidden there for a history. So I wouldn't rule that out yet. But it's one of those common histories that we have that goes along with the time of the giants and the time when the gods were ruling on Earth in the Golden Age and before the flood. So perhaps these were also recreated after the flood, or perhaps somehow with that technology and access through the portals, they somehow survived the flood. So I would say my answer on the alien question is it's some of all of that.
Here's No Baloney Mahoney. Will there be a time we see the invisible made visible? Fallen angels?
Is he referring to the invisible ones as being made visible?
Yes. Invisible ones being made visible. That's right.
Yeah, and that's very much a terrific term, because the invisible ones are what the Rosicrucians, who are the first society created by the fallen Templars, call themselves, because they speak with the ascended ones or the invisible ones and are in contact with them, and that's where a lot of their knowledge comes from. And so, yes, these ones that they're talking about, whether or not these are demon spirits and or fallen angels, or if you want to describe them as alien entities, they will become visible again in the end time, and we will see some of them come out of the abyss. And by the time Revelation 12 happens at the midpoint of the last 7 years, they will be amongst us on the earth.
Let me ask you this. Actually, this is also a question here in the chat room. What do you think about Ezekiel's wheel inside of wheel description?
Yeah, it's an awesome description.
I know.
And so wheel goes back to the word Ophan, and it means eyes, actually means a wheel. And in the description, you have these eyes within the wheel in the description in Ezekiel, and it's what God in the physical world is moving around on with his throne. And but what's interesting about that is when you take that now back to First Enoch, and it talks about the watchers that surround the throne. It's very, very congruent with what the Bible talks about, except that the Bible doesn't talk about these wheel things as being a type of angel, but First Enoch does. So you've got the cherubim around the throne in First Enoch, and you have the seraphim, who are the serpent angels, and you have the Ophanim. And that Ophan is the same Hebrew word that's in Greek, that's used as a being or an angel in Enoch as being, the word for wheel that we only get the English word for as opposed to the original Hebrew. But on, you have the male plural. And the description in Ezekiel is slightly different for these four-faced wheel creatures, the Ophanim, than what are for the cherubim. And so they're very much like the cherubim, but they're somehow distinct and are operating the wheels of the throne, and the cherubim are beside and above, but not in the wheels. Only the Ophanim are. So that's who I think that they're talking about here, are these angelic beings, as opposed to the mechanical structure that people try and look at that from. I really like to go back to Hebrew and the original Hebrew and the original Greek for the New Testament as much as possible to get the full understanding, particularly when I'm cross-referencing with other books like Enoch or other words that come about, around the world, like the term watchers, which is the same sort of meaning for the word for the Urshu gods or the Neter gods out of Egypt, which are, the Ogdo gods, the parent gods. They were to watch, means to watch. They were the watchers. And just as, watcher is the meaning for the name dragon and drakon out of Greek, that the word dragon comes from. See, all of this is always connected if you can find the commonalities. And these are the same terms that are used for the Anunnaki, and none of that is a coincidence.
Here's another one for you, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to make sure I try to get as many of these in for you. Where did I find it? What do you think of clouds as entities?
I don't look at them as entities. I look at that as an allegory for an entity, just as angels can be called clouds, and Jesus is going to come in the end time on clouds. I look at it more as that, but I look at what the clouds that we have here are actually what we know of as physical clouds. It's part of our atmosphere, part of the moisture, part of what makes our weather. So I suppose one could look at it. Well, angels could disguise themselves as clouds. Sure, they could. They can take any form that they want in the physical world, but typically no.
Now let me turn and close the question or close the show out by talking about you and where people can find you and find your book.
Well, the best way to get a hold of me or find me is on my website, which is www.genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And on there, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of my book, and you'll get a good feel for it. So if you wanted to get a signed copy, you can get one from there. If you wanted to buy it from Barnes & Noble, you can link to barnesandnoble.com from there, or amazon.com, or to the Kindle version. If you wanted to support your local bookstore, it may not be on the shelves, but it is distributed by Bookmasters, so they can order it in. And most online bookstores will have it. So very easy way of getting book, lots of ways. And if you wanted to ask me a question, or if I drop many of the documents, because I'm always talking about documents that I make available for people, like if you wanted one on the lineman Nephilim, or the Tengu, or the Serpent connections to the Nephilim, or anything on Nephilim, I got documents like crazy. Get a hold of me through my website, email, or if you're on Facebook, you can look me up under Gary Wayne. Send me a message on Messenger. If you ask me a question or ask for a document, I will get back to you. You can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. And I tend to put out a detailed commentary on a whole variety of topics, from secret societies to giants to end-time prophecy, about every week to week and a half. So if you really want to go deep on detail, those documents are for you.
Well, Gary, with that being said, I want us to say hang by for a second so I can thank you off air. And to everyone else, I want to wish you a good night, or unless you're on the other side of this planet, then I wish you a good morning. With that being said, we are signing off.